Recognizing a problem, developing a policy that responds to the problem, placing it on the agenda, and passing it in the legislative process are only the first steps of public policy. The policy must be implemented. At each stage of the policy and political process, how and whether a policy can be implemented must receive careful consideration. Many problems with implementation might arise, including the feasibility to bring the goal into fruition, administrators who do not implement policy, improper implementation leads to unforeseen consequences. The policy might conflict with another policy, conflict among levels of government, federal, state, and local, conflict with other groups, etc. Another consideration is how might the policy be implemented: fines, imprisonment, persuasion, licenses, etc. And who will bear these penalties: the individual, the bureaucrat, or the state? Let us consider some of these ideas regarding implementation. Some policies cannot be properly implemented. Recently, the New York State Assembly passed a policy which prohibits the use of conversion therapy on minors. This therapy attempts to change the sexual preferences of minors who are homosexuals, thereby converting them into heterosexuals. Development of this policy came on the heels of a suicide resulting from the therapy, as indicated in the suicide note. The catalyst of this policy is not at issue in this lecture, but rather the difficulty of implementing such a policy. Typically, a minor who undergoes such therapy is brought by his or her parents to a therapist who sanctions the therapy. If conversion therapy is made illegal, how will the violators be detected? The parents will not turn in the therapist will not turn in the parents, and most likely the minor will not turn in the parents or the therapist. The minor might confide in a relative or a close friend, but would this confidant alarm the authorities? In many cases, the family and community endorse conversion therapy. The most effective way to catch the violators, both the therapist and the parents, is through an undercover operation. The authorities must be disguised as a therapist or parents. Catching the violators becomes much like catching those engaged in the illicit drug black market. But unlike the illicit drug trade, most likely the parents and the therapists are part of a community that for the most part do not engage in illegal activities. For those who support the banning of conversion therapy, the policy is noble. Nonetheless, it might also prove to be ineffective. Perhaps the policy is more symbolic, indicating that the state does not sanction such therapy. A more effective policy might be to educate the public of the damage conversion therapy might incur and result in suicide. Often policies are good, yet fail because they are not properly implemented. Before the 1990s, the drinking age varied from state to state, between the ages of 16 and 21. Louisiana had a minimum age for the purchasing of alcohol, but no minimum age for its consumption, provided the minor was with his or her parent. But in the early 1990s, the federal government set the minimum age at 21. Each state had the prerogative whether to change state law upholding the federal minimum age. However, if a state did not, it lost much of its federal highway fund. Many states raised the minimum age to 21, but yet did not implement it until threatened by the federal government. For example, in the early 1990s, often if an 18-year-old enters a bar, the doorman would go through the motions and ask him if he is 21. The 18-year-old would simply lie and enter the establishment. Sometimes an 18-year-old would show an obviously fraudulent driver's license and be allowed in the bar. The problem is that those who were to implement the policy were also hurt by the policy. The bars in Washington, D.C. made much of their business from students at the various colleges and universities within and surrounding the city, and most of the students were below the age of 21. Sometimes a policy has an unintended consequence that a lower-level bureaucrat recognizes and so completely ignores the policy. For example, many states adopted a 3 strikes rule. After the 3rd strike, the violator would face time in prison. One with 2 strikes could be cited for jaywalking, which would technically constitute a 3rd strike. A judge who realizes that the jaywalker could be sent to jail might ignore the small infraction of the law. Many policies have a dual problem. Workers refuse to implement the policy for personal reasons, and there are unintended consequences. For example, in 1994, California's Governor Pete Wilson sought to refuse public services to undocumented aliens. If the policy became law, public school teachers, doctors at public hospitals, and even the police would be bound by law to refuse services to illegal aliens. The unforeseen consequences could be serious. Many children would not receive basic education, becoming a burden on society as they become older. Crimes perpetuated against undocumented aliens would not be reported. In such a case, undocumented aliens would resort to paying tribute to an ethnic mafia that would protect them. History has shown ethnic mafias had become strong when the state could not help the immigrants in New York City and Chicago. But the unforeseen consequence probably would not occur because certainly the police and doctors would not take the time to ask for identification in an emergency. Likewise, a public school teacher would not turn in his student when and if he discovers that a student is undocumented. At the time that the policy was being considered, many civil servants chanted, "Let teachers teach, police police, and doctors doctor." Some policies contradict, if not indirectly, other policies. For example, in 2010, New Jersey adopted the Common Core policy. Students are tested on reading and mathematics to see if they are performing at national standards. To prepare students for the exams, teachers had increased the amount of homework and assigned homework during the weekend and holidays. In 2011, some communities contemplated a policy to make weekend and holiday homework illegal and to limit nightly homework to 10 minutes multiplied by the grade. 12th graders could have 120 minutes of homework each night because 12 times 10 equals 120 minutes. Indirectly, the Common Core policy and placing limits on the amount of homework assigned seems to be at odds with each other. Some state and local governments are protective of their political authority. Problems between the federal policies and states' authority were frequent among states. Consider problems with President Johnson's war on poverty. Jeffrey L. Pressman and Aaron Wildavsky, in their book Implementation, argued that the federal government upset state and local officials by directly helping depressed communities without involving the more immediate governments, and therefore denying them the credit. The war on poverty solicited solutions from the grassroots level. If a person had an idea to help his community, he could apply for a grant to work on his project, perhaps an after-school center to prevent children from roaming the streets, or public gardens where people can have a plot of land to grow vegetables. Washington bureaucrats would review the proposal, and then a grant may be awarded directly to the new organization, completely leaving out other officials. Sometimes state and local officials more than resented the federal government's involvement in local affairs, but became completely defiant of federal policies. When the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas in 1954, that segregation was inherently unequal and therefore abolishing segregation in public institutions, many southern states were defiant. Some states suspended public education. When Vivian Malone and James A. Hood, 2 African American students, tried to register for classes at the University of Alabama, Governor George Wallace stood in the doorway of the administration building, physically blocking the students from entering. President Kennedy sent 100 troops from the Alabama National Guard to assist federal officials to escort the students to register and confront Governor Wallace. Policies can be implemented from the top, the federal agencies, or from the bottom, the street bureaucrats, police, doctors, teachers, etc. An agency like FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is managed from the top. Although FEMA encourages state and local agencies to develop emergency plans, when a disaster occurs, FEMA coordinates all emergency groups from the local police to the National Guard. To avoid any conflict among different levels of government, during an emergency, the governor of the state must declare a state of emergency, and the president must recognize the state of emergency. By stating this condition, essentially the governor relinquishes all authority over the emergency, giving FEMA full power. During Hurricane Katrina, a Category 5 hurricane, Kathleen Blanco delayed requesting assistance to help evacuate New Orleans, although she did request assistance for food and shelter. Why did FEMA not take command of the situation? Because the government must request assistance. Why did the governor not make the request? Perhaps she did not want to hand over authority to FEMA. The federal government does not always need to be invited by states to exert authority. The Constitution delegates some exclusive power to the federal government, such as national defense, treaties, and interstate commerce. When the Constitution does not grant authority to the federal government, they can gain control by threatening to withhold federal grants. For example, the federal government raised the drinking age to 21. If the state does not observe the new drinking age, the state is at risk for losing federal highway funds. The more detailed the policy, the more limits and restrictions, the more authority rests in the hands of Congress and the federal bureaucracy. Indeed, Congress has further control over policies by conducting special committees to investigate the implementation of policies.